So thanks a lot, everyone, for having me here. I'm Nataliia, and I want to talk to you about privacy regulations and the web. So we know that on the web, back in '93, we could easily hide our identity, and there was this famous drawing saying on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. Well, today we have a massive data collection, and mostly this comes from the advertising industry, where we have hundreds and thousands of companies who are exchanging the user's data in order to deliver the advertising. So if we have a brief look at what happens actually behind the interface of a typical website, well, we can imagine a web browser that tries to fetch the content of this website, and of course, we as users believe that most of the content is actually used to deliver something that we want to see and interact with. Well, in practice, we have a lot of different JavaScript libraries that are continuously loading content from various servers and then dynamically including even more libraries. And there is no way to know which of them are actually useful for the website functionality and which ones are just there to collect the data of the users. On top of them, many of these libraries are participating in programmatic advertising ecosystem that further sends the user's data down to many more servers that share this data globally and participate in a real-time bidding process just to identify who among these advertisers will actually deliver the ad on the website. So when we look at website, just at one of them, we would see that there are more than several hundreds of HTTP requests and several tens of various cookies. And there is, again, no way to understand which of them actually are needed functionality of the website and which ones are used just to collect the data. So from a very technical perspective, we have today numerous web tracking technologies. I'm sure you've heard about stateful tracking that basically requires to store an identifier of the user in your browser. And a typical example of that are third-party tracking cookies that many of you know about. But there are also other techniques like cookie respawning that actually recreate cookies that you have deleted yourself, synchronization of cookies between different companies just to build a richer profile of the user, other tracking scripts. And recently, we have more technologies based on first-party tracking because of the recent announcements of Google to deprecate third-party cookies. So companies now developed more and more techniques, including cookie syncing, navigational tracking, CNAME clocking. I'm happy to talk to you beyond this talk about these various techniques. Each of them basically represents several scientific papers published in top conferences. We also have stateless browser fingerprinting techniques that just look at your browser and operating system properties, including passive information that's sent with every HTTP request, active JavaScript APIs, or browser extensions, and there was even work showing that your battery can be used to identify you. And there are other forms of tracking, like tracking across various devices, because we do have several of them, server-side tracking, and so on. So I was asked to talk about privacy regulations. So I like a lot this map that comes from the French Data Protection Authority, displaying various personal data protection laws around the world. And you see different colors here on the map because the level of protection that is similar to the one of the European Union is evaluated, and so you have different color for different level of matching. So in my own work, I collaborate with the US scholars where we try to understand what are the EU and US privacy regulations and how they are applied to web tracking technologies. So on this slide, you will see on top that in Europe, we have data protection law that is actually quite old. It started in late 70s. And it followed with the European Data Protection Directive, and then more specific laws that now are applied to web tracking. And in the US, we have FTC Act, HIPAA, and COPPA that maybe some of you know about. And nowadays, we have Californian data protection law that actually is one of the most active and well represented in the US. And there are other states that are considering as well to develop their own laws. So we also, on the lower side of the picture, we have the technical changes. So we have standards, most of them from W3C, and also drafts. So of course, we all know about HTTP cookies, but there are also proposals such as P3P, Do Not Track, and global privacy control. What's also interesting is that browsers in the last year started being extremely active at trying to protect users' privacy. So on the bottom of this figure in green, you will see a lot of different initiatives taken by various browsers trying to protect users from tracking, blocking third-party cookies, but also partitioning the state of a browser and so on and so on. So when we look a little bit deeper in the EU, we actually have 2 current laws that are covering web tracking technologies. So first, the Privacy Directive that gives consent, that requires consent before storing or gaining information on your equipment, and GDPR that sets the conditions for this consent to be valid. And even if in the legal text we only have 4 adjectives, free, given, specific, informed, and unambiguous, in practice it translates into many, many requirements on what consent has to be so that it's compliant. And there are also exceptions. So web tracking techniques can be used for communication or for strictly necessary purpose without any consent. So this situation has given rise to cookie banners. I'm sure many of you have seen them when you travel to Europe and you suddenly see that every website shows you the cookie banner. And they are actually being regulated in the EU. So the way they are regulated is on one side we have binding legal decisions, like from the European Court of Justice, CJEU, and on the other side we have non-binding guidelines, so best practices that regulators put in place saying if you want to be compliant, implement your banners in this way. But as you can imagine, in practice, we have gray zone banners, and they are everywhere. They are neither violating the law nor 100% following the recommendations of the regulators. And this has given rise to dark patterns. So techniques that actually manipulate users through UI and UX into making decisions that they would not want to make themselves. So if we look at just at these 3 banners that you've seen already in the previous slide, we have a reject option that is kind of hidden in the banner. It's put somewhere on the corner or even outside of the main text. And recent research shows that there are 68% of the 16,000 top websites in the world that do implement this type of nudging that is not fully regulated. So if we come back to my figure, I want to ask a question of what happens behind the interface, because there is a lot of work showing that, yes, we are manipulated by these interfaces, but what happens behind the interface? Well, in theory, when we are visiting a website, from a regulatory perspective, there should be no trackers that require consent that are loaded before we interacted with this banner. Well, in reality, we still have many of them that are actually loaded. So there is a global problem of non-compliance because trackers are loaded prior to consent. So here on this slide, you see several examples of academic works on this. So prior to interaction with banner, we have between 70 and 90% of the websites that still actually use cookies with identifiers or tracking cookies. And moreover, even when the user refuses consent, there are still a lot, between 65 and 96% of the web, depending on what you measure, of course, that shows that we have a big problem of non-compliance. So if we try to think of how to audit compliance on the web, there are actually several stages, several problems that we have to address. So first is, how can we understand which technology we are looking at? If we are seeing a third-party JavaScript library, what does it do, right? Does it set cookies or does it implement fingerprinting? And this is an active area of web privacy measurement research. There are many techniques and tools that have been built for that. The next problem is, once we know which tracking technology is present, we have to understand what's the purpose. Is it used for advertising, or is it used for fraud detection or bot detection? And these are completely different purposes. And from regulatory perspective, advertising would require consent, while bot detection is a security for the website, which would not require consent. And this is a big global problem, and only one solution was proposed so far to map cookies to purposes with certain machine learning-based techniques. And even if we know the purpose, it's even harder to understand which one requires consent because there is still ongoing legal debate in the EU about this question. So I want to bring 2 recommendations to W3C. So first, I think we still need a general taxonomy of purposes. This is something that doesn't exist on the web today. And yet, in order to understand And to study automatically the web ecosystem, we need to be able to reason about these purposes. And in the industry, I think these purposes are kind of known, and yet in the standards, we don't know anything about them. And second technical challenge is that we need to declare what tracking technology is used for which purpose. So far, we only have those declarations partially in privacy policies that are extremely difficult to analyze and to extract that knowledge. And I think we need to have that on a technical level, hopefully through standards. My second and last example is the recording of consent. So if you imagine you interact with a banner, you want the website to record that what is it, the consent that you have given. And you want this consent to be recorded correctly, and also you want it to be communicated, of course, to all these parties that are actually getting your data. On top of that, if you change your mind, which again is a right in many countries, in Europe it's called withdrawal of consent, you want everyone to be informed of that, right? They are not supposed to use your data anymore. Well, recent research shows that this is not the case. Most of the parties are still not informed, even if I went to the banner and I said, no, I changed my mind. And again, we have a big problem of non-compliance because consent is not recorded correctly. Our own research shows that some websites even store accept, even if you explicitly refused in the banner interface, because we were able to decode that consent representation that's stored in your browser. Third parties are not globally informed of your consent withdrawal, and there is a strong legal implication because GDPR requires to delete all the data that you have used as a company so far when the person withdraws their consent. So there are several alternatives, alternative signals that many of you know, of course. There was a Do Not Track that was a very active group in W3C. But if we look at Do Not Track from the regulatory perspective, there was a recent statement from the European Data Protection Board that represents all the EU data protection regulators, saying that they are not imposing a general requirement to respect Do Not Track settings, and that they have not accessed any current use of signals that is granular and specific enough to give a legally valid consent. However, they are considering the implementation of refusal signals that could help reduce cookie fatigue. So maybe one hope for this kind of signal for refusal is global privacy control that's currently a draft at W3C, and the California Consumer Protection Act actually supports officially GPC as an expression of global opt-out choice, which is quite different from the European opt-in consent. So we may consider this, and maybe in the EU we have the right to withdraw consent implemented through GPC. So the challenge left is we need a global standard, not only for refusing, but also for recording and communicating consent that is also auditable at scale. Thank you very much.